for the topic for this message, a little poem I learned from in the fourth grade, one in early school, from a poet called Ogden Nash. To forget and forgive is a good way to live. I've carried that with me. I ain't say I always practice it, but I've carried that with me since elementary school. I've tried. I ain't always made it. But I have always remembered that little thought, that little poem. And I came to encourage you. I think we all need some encouragement. Everybody needs encouragement, some point or another. And even though the year is young, if you haven't ran into a situation yet where you're going to need some encouragement, just keep on living enough. You're going to find situations where you're going to find yourself needing somebody to encourage you sooner or later. Either we hit a plateau and we need a little encouragement, or worse yet, we can hit rock bottom and need somebody to come and give us an encouraging word. And that's why the Bible tells us, it says, therefore encourage one another and let each one strengthen his friend. We ought to encourage one another. Hebrews says that we should come together in worship before it says, forsake not. Don't give up the assembling of yourselves together. But come together and encourage one another, because you don't know when it's going to be the last day. Either Jesus might come back today or it might be your last day. But we need to encourage one another. That's why the church come together, not to be seen or to see, but we come together. Why do we go to church? One reason we come together so we can encourage somebody. Because the old folks say there may be somebody down in the valley trying to get home. Said another problem at the church at Corinth is that they value spiritual gifts more than the giver, because they had certain spiritual gifts. They begin to exalt themselves rather than exalt and praise God for the one that gave them the gift. Some gifts we value more in the church today. We value healing a lot in the church today. That's a spiritual gift. Some get excited about speaking in tongues. That's a spiritual gift. Some get excited about interpreting tongues. That's a spiritual gift. Some get excited about teaching. That's a spiritual gift. But the bottom line is that your gift is not a necessarily barometer of your holiness. Ain't because you've been so good, God said, I got to give you something. No, your gift is because of how good God is. It's based on how good God is, not how good you are. And the gift is not that we might be elevated. The gift is for the elevation and the edification of the church. In other words, he gave you the gift to bless somebody else with. He didn't give you the gift for everybody to look at you. He gave you the gift so everybody can look at him and give him the glory. We get that thing twisted. The church at Corinth not only had a problem worshiping or looking up the spiritual gift, they were a very sensual church. So much so that they even glorified and were not ashamed of a man having his father's wife. So much so that the heathen, the Gentile, those who didn't know the Lord were talking about this messed up church. But I come to bring encouragement from a Corinthian church this morning. Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, set things in order, taught them about church discipline, and said that now when the church comes together, the problem in the church, after we have prayed, after we've checked our egos at the door, after we've checked our flesh at the door, when we come in prayer, that's when we deal with issues of the church. He told them to come together and deal with this man and deal with yourselves also, because you didn't see anything wrong with the sin. And you know the church today, help me Holy Ghost to preach this word. The church today sometimes doesn't seem to have a problem with some sins now. We are afraid to call sin, sin. We want to be in 2016. We want to be modern. We want to feel like that we are politically correct, so we don't call sin, sin. But how many of you know that all have sinned and came short of the glory of God? Cast them into the sea of forgetfulness. And if God can forget about it, why are you still holding on to it? if God can let it go, why are you still dealing with it? If God, who is holy and righteous, can overlook my faults, why are you still hung up on yesterday? For the Bible says now to continue, Paul says in his letter, to continue to hold us against this man can cause him to be overly burdened by his sin. How can this man feel like coming back home if every now and then, every time he comes back from the pig pen of sin, all we can do is remind him that he came from the pig pen? When the prodigal son came home, the daddy didn't need to tell him he came from the pig pen. There was mud between his toes to remind him he came from the pig pen. His clothes were dirty to remind him he came from the pig pen. He didn't have any shoes on his feet to remind him he came from the pig pen. Don't nobody need to remind us of where we came from. But the Father says, now that he came home, it's time to throw a party and to celebrate, because my son was lost, but now he's found. My son was blind, but now he can see. Is there anybody here today that knows that when people come back from the pig pen of sin, it's time for you and me to celebrate and give God praise, because God has brought somebody back? If the angels in heaven can celebrate when one sinner comes to God, how dare us look down our sanctified, self-righteous nose at somebody that God has brought back? But we ought to say, if it had not been for the Lord on my side, it could have been me down in the pit